This is episode 115 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. This week I am pleased to be joined by former New Mexico State Representative Janice Arnold Jones.
Good morning. Nice to see you, Paul.
And David Casas.
Good morning, Paul.
Hi, and you all are part of a informal group. I guess that's the definition of an ad hoc group, thus the name ad hoc. Tell us about this ad hoc group that is coming together and what your goals are.
Well, let me start. There are quite a number of people across many spectrums who understand that if we don't talk to one another, we are not going to solve problems. And in our state, we have become so polarized in terms of politics that we're not even talking to our families. How on earth are we going to change the direction of our state if we don't talk about those shared values? And it was very clear that we had shared values. And so I will turn that over to David, because one of the things that he has taught me is how we need to ask questions to make sure we open that conversation. And once you get to shared values, then you have a measure for evaluating political messages. And what we have come to the conclusion is in New Mexico, we share a certain set of values, not the least of which is we believe in faith, family, and freedom.
David?
Well, thank you, Janice. My fundamental approach to this discussion is that you take the average citizen laborer who goes home and sits across the dining room table from his wife and says, you know, honey, I think you might be having to take a part-time job because we're not quite making it to pay the bills, and maybe our oldest child can go out and get a part-time job after school to help out. And so those things that affect my paycheck are the ones that I am most interested in. All the other issues to me are not unimportant, but not as important to me as that dining room table discussion with my family about how we're making it from month to month with our paychecks. Things that affect my paycheck, such as higher taxes, higher rent, gross receipts tax, all of those things take money out of my paycheck, and they're of concern to me, and they then lead into the discussions of tax policy and labor unions and undocumented workers diluting the workforce, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so you started off, Janice mentioned faith, and you mentioned taxes, and then also illegal immigration and a couple other things. So what do you all view as the core New Mexico values? And more importantly, what evidence do you have that those are currently core New Mexico values?
Well, let me see. So there was a lot of work done, and so we label it in 6 areas: faith, family, and freedom, which covers a lot of things. But at the end of the day, faith, family, freedom is our commitment to our families
3.
and community. But it's
okay.
all kind of the same. We love our country, we love our state, but most importantly, we love our families. We want them to do well. Cohesive community, which turned out to be a very interesting discussion. But we want our communities to thrive. We want them to be crime-free, amazing. We want them to be growing. And currently, the policies of our government's doing anything but that. And certainly not safe. We are adamant about equal opportunity. You have the right to go try to do anything you want to do, literally. And you also have the right to fail, but to try again, which if you're listening to some of our policies that are coming from the city of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico, equal opportunity is actually going out the door. Healthcare. You hear on a regular basis that healthcare is a right. We think healthcare is a responsibility, and you are a major player in that. So it changes the way that the discussion happens. But jobs, absolutely. none of this makes any difference if you can't put food on the table and you can't pay your bills. And the last is we all share the desire, the wish that New Mexico prosper. And that's, but there are lots of subpoints to all of these things. So the key is once you kind of get a hold of what are the subpoints, how do you ask a question to start a conversation? David, did I cover that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
All right. So those are some general areas. And, I did ask for evidence. I mean, I think those are very good personally, but we're kind of conservative free market type people, and New Mexico is anything but a conservative free market type state. So how do you get from the values that we all seem, a lot of us seem to share, and the political dynamics that we have, but show me that those are in fact the values of John Q. New Mexican or Juan Q. New Mexican?
I see. So what was our methodology to get there? Part of it was bringing together a group that did not share the same perspective. Was there some polling data around a lot of this? There's a lot of national polling data, and we sifted through and looked at polling data that showed what were the top issues. The only one that was really quite unique, and it's our label, actually it's David's label, is a cohesive community. The issue of safety is a big deal. And in that issue of safety comes in other questions like the fight for the Second Amendment. Safety is a big deal, but having a community that we like to live in. But that was much more amorphous. Everything else was founded in data that had already been produced, and that was both national and state.
I think that the way I approach this is if I have that perspective of trying to have my family prosper, one is I would like to elect officials that have that in mind when they pass laws that restrict or guide law enforcement to be able to affect their laws. People who are politicians who restrict law enforcement from being able to do their jobs, their sworn jobs, are more of a roadblock to being able to affect a solution to the community's problems in crime. Let me give you another facet that just gives you a little bit more of a perspective on the discussion. I am a devoutly faithful to my religion. In New Mexico, we have many, many religious practices. I want the freedom to be able to follow the guidelines of my religion without interruption, without some law that deviates from my religious beliefs. It doesn't matter what the religion is. The core values I would say to almost every religious doctrine is faith and family and the service to their community. So when I have a politician inject themselves into skewing what my faith and religious practice is, I think that there's maybe a diversion of the importance of my beliefs, my core beliefs.
Okay, so we obviously the Rio Grande Foundation's primary focus is economic policy, and I'm happy to talk about some of these religious aspects, but we do concern ourselves with the First Amendment and the ability of people to freely express themselves in a religious context. So talk a little bit about any politicians that have inflicted or made it difficult for you to practice your religion. I can think of a lot of examples of politicians saying that they're of a religious background and not living up to that, but I haven't seen, admittedly, a lot of restrictions imposed on religious groups or people in New Mexico. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I am not an expert on being able to quote to you some statistic, but the examples that I've listened to are the restriction of my ability to conduct my business, according to my moral beliefs. That would be a political decision. And the question I would ask is, am I free to practice my religion in my business practice? And as long as a person is not being excluded from being able to participate as a fully fledged member of the community, I don't see that a political application to my business is in any way beneficial to anyone. If you don't like the cake that I decorate, go to the cake store down the street.
Okay, you're referring to Elaine Photography, which is an excellent example that right here in New Mexico, and folks can go Google what that's all about. But okay, so let's talk more broadly about all these different issue areas. Where you're obviously talking about something of a culture and philosophical shift among the broader population, but bleeding definitely into politics. So where is the disconnect in New Mexico? If you say these are, broadly speaking, our values, why don't we elect politicians that seem to reflect those values, Janice Arnold-Jones?
Well, I think what we have all seen in New Mexico are the historic Democrats. And they are now saying, whoa, enough. I don't believe in anything that says I'm not allowed to defend my family, myself, or my property. And what are these people that I have voted for? What are they doing? That is a real issue in the state of New Mexico. When we have issues of being able to use our private property, including our land, it becomes a question. And so why are we voting consistently for an agenda most definitely run right now by the progressive Democrats that does not reflect what we believe? As an example, and one of the things that bothered me most sitting in the city council in Albuquerque was when groups would come in and say, we want you to make a law that says people can't say this. And that is just, that goes right to the core of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. You may not like it, you can leave, but people have a right to express themselves. And having as a measure hurting somebody's feeling is not good for us, and most New Mexicans recognize that. What we have done is to create a shorthand tool to help people who are in this quandary say, wait a minute, there is another way to measure those politicians as they run.
And this is for either of you, since it's important to get our terms locked down here in this conversation. Sure. Progressive Democrats, we've talked a fair amount about the progressive rise in New Mexico and how they've kind of pushed out the traditional Democrats. But from your perspectives, what are some of the red flags or the keys to being a progressive Democrat versus a traditional Democrat? What are some of those differences?
I'm not an expert on that topic. I'm sorry, but I have read the history of the Progressive Party and how they approached trying to solve society's problems with academia and science and so on and so forth. But they've wavered off that. They've gone off the path and inflicted into the discussion bomb-throwing emotional topics that divert us from being able to discuss community issues without the very loud and strong emotion that monopolizes conversation.
Janice?
So in our state in particular, our delegation, SANS 1, just voted for a $15 an hour minimum wage. The majority of our businesses are actually owned by Hispanic families. And any of us who have ever owned a business understand that when you impose a rule that is contrary to market forces, that something's got to give. You either cut employees, you cut hours, you add technology, or you shut down. Those are kind of shared values, and that is as you know, in the last cycle, $15 an hour minimum wage was the the standard bearer, and that was after impeaching the president, but also open borders. What does open borders do for the state of New Mexico? And it's very clear in the state of New Mexico that the majority of people think that you should follow the law, you should respect the law. But when you have a whole other group of people who are coming in who are not legal, who are then hired by business, and this is where we're going to get into a little bit of a debate, what does that do to wages? Drives it down.
Well, just from our perspective, and like I said, we've talked about this a fair amount on the show, progressives and the traditional Democrats are in many ways different, but guns and cultural norms, abortion,
abortion
New Mexico's
is a big key.
Always been a pretty left-wing state on abortion, but the progressives are much more aggressive about imposing these kinds of values on people. And real quick, economically as well, they're much more aggressive in their push for more government spending. They just have a very systematic view of this. Not that New Mexico hasn't always had more or less left-wing policies economically, but the progressives are just more organized, more ideological, and more aggressive about transforming the entire culture in a different direction. And we'll see where that breaking point is. A lot of your work, a lot of our work really relies on the traditional Democrats breaking with the progressives at some point.
You're absolutely right. And I make no bones about it. This conversation is a way to break from the progressives. The Democrats, as they were okay. But where we have gone in this state, especially on the family values issue, the issue of abortion, if you are a Hispanic Catholic in this state, you are almost, I'm going to say 90% anti-abortion, anti-killing babies. But all the people that they're voting for have signed on to that agenda. How do you resolve that conflict? And so the purpose of this ad hoc messaging group is to change the conversation. And we know it's a lot of work. We're talking about changing the tide.
David?
I would argue that certain issues that are brought to the fore are a means to an end rather than the issue itself being the most important discussion that we should be having. It just generates great emotion, and rather than focusing on a debate on the issue, which was a means to an end, is to step back and look at those dining room table issues that I had originally discussed. So the question I would ask is, if you have a large group of undocumented laborers in the community, do you think they will have to labor in order to make a living at some point, and employers will be hiring them on some level? They will dilute the wage that can be offered to the common laborer. New Mexico is a poor state, and it's fertile ground for any type of disruptive politics to be able to say, you haven't been treated right historically, let's turn the apple cart over and form a new government. Well, turning the apple cart over is neither good for the cart nor the apples if you don't have a direction, a clear plan to fulfill the vacuum. And so that's the dilution of wages.
Well, let me jump in on that, because the immigration issue, I'm pretty libertarian. Rio Grande Foundation doesn't really focus on immigration per se, but broadly speaking, if I were in charge, say I'm in Trump's spot there as president, which I do think it's largely a federal issue here. One of the challenges that you have with immigrants, if you're an immigrant themselves, is the waiting list and the lack of numbers that are allowed to come into the United States to be citizens. But secondly, there's all these open jobs, and we know that in the current economy, there are more open jobs than people who are unemployed. And we know that the government benefits keep a lot of Americans fat and happy on the sidelines, collecting those government checks. And you have people who want to fill those positions from Mexico and Central America. So I think we need a system. It could be a worker system where people come to the United States to work. But I guess my broader point with either or both of you is it's not that diluting wages and whatnot is the issue. It's many Americans, because they've been induced by these government benefits, will simply not take a lot of the jobs that Mexicans or Central Americans will do. So how do we, A, reinstate the work ethic, and B, try to be a little more welcoming towards people from some of these countries without necessarily just signing them up to vote right away? So Janice, you're gesticulating. So I'm going to, I know that was a little bit of a long question, but I'm taking an issue with something you're saying. So I want to give you a thorough understanding of what I was saying.
As you know, when I ran for Congress in 2018, my top issue was fixing our immigration policies. Believe it or not, in the state of New Mexico, we need employees. Employees. Yeah, right. Sorry.
We need workers.
We need workers. Absolutely. But the process is so broken, everybody loses. And I mean everybody. And I am so angry at our congressional delegation. Not one of them until just recently, and I think I disagree with the piece that Heinrich and Udall just introduced, but up until 2 weeks ago, not one member introduced a piece of legislation to correct the asylum laws or to fix the immigration process. And there are many opportunities to fix this, because the truth is we need workers. We do, for this state to prosper, because our population is so small. Our geography is so big, but we have things happening here. We need workers, and everything that is happening right now.
Okay, but you're conflicting with what David just said about depressing wage rates.
I'm saying, but the problem about depressing wage rates is if you come over and you are in the dark, the best you can do is off the books, probably lower wages. That's what he's talking about. I'm talking about the fact that our government is not doing its job. It's not fixing a problem that is well known, and it is hurting us. It is hurting our entire community. This is not an anti-immigrant community by any stretch. We have always welcomed people, but now with the dichotomy of you're either for illegal immigrants or you're against illegal immigrants, now nobody is winning, and certainly not the immigrants, but we're not winning either. And so I say we're kind of together here. It's just a different side of the issue.
All right, David, any other thoughts on that?
Well, if you were to look at the problem a couple of steps back, and you were to just let's discuss the idea of labor shortages. Canada has had a guest worker program since about 1974. Certainly they have their own problems. They have recruiting stations throughout the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico where an employer will list the job that they want to have a guest worker for. They state the wage. The laborer pays a little bit for the transportation and for the Canadian medical system, but there are 3 generations of families that have gone to Canada and never set foot in the United States and have been enrolled in that program. So if you want a real solution, there are solutions to the idea of labor shortage, the need. We also have the special category for people that have certain skills that they can get a certain visa to come in. That has been abused a little bit, but that's being investigated quite a bit. My point being that there are solutions to labor shortages, and the solution is not an open border.
Okay, right. We're gonna leave the immigration discussion, but it sounds to me, and I kind of am in this boat as well, that not necessarily thrilled with the president and his anti-immigrant rhetoric and some of the statements, et cetera, about the system, but we're not on board with the progressive viewpoint that let's bring as many people over here illegally as possible, sign them all up to vote in a quasi-legal way, which New Mexico saw tremendous changes to its voting system that will help enable that kind of behavior. But the fact is that neither political party seems geared towards really solving the heart of the immigration issue. Is that?
Well, I would say there's that, and let me just throw in one other piece. Where's technology? Do you know we have people sitting in lines in places that nobody likes? So why are we not processing people online so that most of the paperwork is done and that when they present themselves in person, we're doing the biometrics to complete it? Clearly, Congress has decided not to fund the Border Patrol. ICE is limited, but the Border Patrol actually does this piece. And this is not new. This is going back 20 years, and yet our government has failed us. And I think people are very angry about this.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about economics. And out of your points, you talk about equal opportunity, healthcare, which of course is a sub area of economics, jobs, making New Mexico prosperous. So a lot of points there about the economy. Rio Grande Foundation, that is our bailiwick. Talk about messaging, though, with regard to the economy, because right now it's, I think, a tough issue in some ways because we've seen this progressive shift, but we also are seeing boom times generated by an industry that the progressives hate, and New Mexico's economy is doing very well for a variety of reasons, but most notably the oil and gas boom in the Permian Basin. So how do you message economy at a time when things are doing pretty well here in New Mexico under progressive rule?
Well, I would say so under progressive rule, but the truth is they are doing everything to kill it. The Energy Transition Act is a death knell to oil and gas in the southeastern part of the state. And as you have seen, any issue of nuclear power, they have tried to shut down. And I'm sure if you've talked to John Heaton, this is not where we're going, but anybody who has any science in their background understands that if we're going to go to a clean energy solution, everything that the progressives have proposed isn't going to work, and you're going to end up in a cave. And people understand this, but we need to find a way to talk about it. So we're absolutely there, including what makes us better if we are a welfare state. Absolutely nothing.
David, how do you talk about these economic and energy issues?
Fat cats don't hunt. When you have free money coming from the oil industry, it postpones planning for the long term. One of the things that I would inject into the conversation, going back to dining room table issues and the family trying to discuss their future prosperity, is how is my adolescent going to become educated and be able to obtain a work that is going to be good for them? Here's an idea. Why don't we make New Mexico the vocation education capital of the United States? Oklahoma has a fantastic vocational education system. And 1 out of 4, recently written in one of the news articles, was 1 out of 4 people will benefit from a 4-year college education. What happens to the rest of the population? So if I could have an apprenticeship program in high school, maybe a journeyman in a community college or trade school, eligibility to go on to a master's level certification, I can see a track for my young family member to become educated and prepare themselves for the world. We would also attract industry with job-ready employees that have had the basics of good education, vocational education, so that industry and corporate can move into the state. You know, we have one of the best universities in the world in Socorro. That's science background and all the other subjects that they teach there. We export these experts.
Right. But as you go forward, if I might, especially with education, what the progressives are doing is devaluing all of those other things. You know what? I have to make a date with my plumber because they are so overworked. It's a really interesting problem, and the electrician's even worse. Absolute value in that. But when you have progressives on the stump saying, yes, we have to have free college education. It is the only way that we're going to go. And you have a degree in, Angolian Heights yarn production. You know what? There's no value to that. And so having these discussions allows us to kind of bring that out. Does that make any sense? No, it doesn't make sense.
Well, New Mexico, I don't know if you know this, but historically has been one of the most generous, lavish funders of higher education. David, I agree with you 100% about vocational issues and training more of those folks. So if we just diverted a small percentage of money away from UNM and the traditional big campuses, because they have so many campuses across our state, we could do a lot more with vocational tech issues, and it would be a great opportunity. I posted a blog. There was a story in the Albuquerque Journal where a professor, he was talking about the cuts to higher education, and indeed there have been cuts over the last decade, but New Mexico still remains one of the top funders of higher education. And so we have the resources there, and I agree, those are being exported. Those smart young people, unless they're doing something at the labs or in the petroleum industry, they are by and large being exported. Janice?
Absolutely. So again, we don't always dig down, but this administration early on actually changed some of the labor laws and have allowed and have provided funding for apprenticeships in places like water utility users, electricians, plumbers, that had never been available before, so that companies are actually allowed to go out and use these programs. The kicker for the company is that they have to guarantee employment for X amount of years. What a great deal.
By administration, are we
we're talking federal government.
Federal government. Okay,
Absolutely.
Just making sure, because, well, Michelle Lujan Grisham and quite frankly, a number of New Mexico elected officials over the years have talked about apprenticeships and expanding those opportunities for non-college attendees or graduates. But what you actually do about it is a very different topic.
I would say an implementation, boy, we could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, that's not a messaging issue per se. But, talk about healthcare. We got to have that conversation a little bit, because it's an area, especially that the federal government in Washington has been trying to do some things about. It's a very important issue for all families, and the left is really coalescing around this issue of Medicare for all. So talk about the messaging against free stuff.
Well, I say so let's begin with Medicare for all in a rural state like New Mexico. That means we will all have equally bad access to health care. And that's all we're talking about is access. If you don't have a doctor, it does not matter. And let me just offer to you, Paul. So we have I noticed that Netflix has taken it in the shorts again today. We have expended tremendous amounts of money to bring the film industry here. What would have happened if we had provided those incentives for medical professionals to practice in the state? We are running out of doctors. So you can talk about free healthcare all day long. If there's nobody to help you, it does not matter.
David?
Well, with regard to the medical area, you start with the basics that no one is denied health care. It's a federal law that everyone that walks into an emergency room can be stabilized with their medical condition and then directed to the secondary source to be able to manage the problem. So in the first place, there's no one that is denied health care. That's just a myth. With regard to the financial incentives, the federal government has had long-standing programs to recruit medical professionals into the Indian Health Service, into the Veterans Administration, and that goes with tuition reimbursement for a contracted tour of duty or assignment to maybe a rural area. Those systems have been in place for a very, very long time. I agree with Janice that someone put the money in the wrong pocket when they decided to spend money for incentives. The incentives should not have been for the film industry to the largesse that it turned out to be, we could have a very excellent film industry program without being so generous. But those monies could have been diverted to recruiting medical professionals. And I think if we have that sense of pride in our state, I think that if a medical professional spends any amount of time here, they have a very high probability of staying here.
Right. So, but we have, if I might add, we have a really real problems in terms of medical care delivery. So in a town like Lordsburg, they used to have a pharmacist. They no longer have a pharmacist. And when you have the majority of your population on Medicaid, the pharmacist, who is not a government pharmacist, but a free enterprise, single standing business, was actually denied the ability to actually continue. And there are other things. The pharmacists became older. There's nobody to relieve them. And so now Lordsburg has no pharmacist. And so you have to go to Silver City to get your drugs. You got to get them mailed in.
So obviously, great points. I mean, stuff that we at the Rio Grande Foundation have been talking about for a long time. I wanted to point out another recent blog posting. There's a petition online from MoveOn.org. It's actually a doctor. You can do your own petition, but MoveOn's a left-wing website, and the title of it is Medicaid Reimbursement Should Not Be Subject to Gross Receipts Tax. We've been talking about the gross receipts tax for decades. And the petition says, in part, the gross receipts tax is traditionally reserved for retail businesses that charge consumers a tax on items bought and sold. I cannot bill my clients a GRT as the clients I see receive Medicaid due to compromised incomes and are living below the poverty line. How can I charge them GRT when they see me? So I absorb the tax. And, you know, that we have a huge Medicaid population here. A lot of doctors
42%
providing those services. In the state of New Mexico, with all these progressives running around saying they want universal health care, they are still taxing Medicaid providers who are helping the poor out. Ultimately, those are some of the doctors that are going to be leaving the state.
Absolutely, which is key to having this discussion is you've got to talk about what's really happening. So I don't disagree with that doctor, but let us talk about column M. And as you know, I am, when that change was made, the cost to doctors compared to our 3 surrounding states was 15% in tax liability, plus they had to hire more people to report to the state of New Mexico. And we want to provide Medicare for all in the state of New Mexico when you're treating your providers that way. Good luck with that.
And finally, we have and we're got a few minutes left, but we're rapidly coming to a close here in terms of our 40 minutes of conversation. I know, but Rio Grande Foundation just put out a video on corporate welfare, specifically the film industry, and that's a unique corporate welfare enterprise because we're cutting checks to the film industry. But I would encourage you to use this as a basis for some of your arguments because you have progressives, in this case, guys like John Oliver, the talk show host, Bernie Sanders, and other Democrat politicians talking about how Hollywood subsidies are indeed corporate welfare. It's bad public policy, and it inflicts pain on the poor. So, yeah.
And again, in our tax structure, and I will just say, Paul, if we can move this conversation to where we actually have tax reform in the state of New Mexico, what a boon. How long have you and I been talking about it? Since about 2004?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yet, in this tax division that the progressives have given this one industry, it's a credit against expenses. Please, this is not even a tax. They are getting cash back before they've even paid any taxes. Give me a break. Why is your business not as important as that? I don't understand that.
Exactly.
Things that affect the common laborer. I've never heard of a progressive that didn't want to pick your wallet for something. And so here I am. I get my paycheck. And what is affecting my paycheck? Well, if you increase property taxes on my landlord, my rent goes up. Gross receipts tax takes money out of my pocket every time I go and buy commodities to be able to support my family. So the question I would ask is, I think there's an excellent discussion on the internet about having the free market medical care approach, where you have the prices stated are by the providers, and saying how much do I have to charge to actually continue my practice. When the government is the largest purchaser of healthcare services, they dictate what is going to be charged for the services. So I think a free market economy will allow the marketplace dynamic to be able to help that common laborer. New Mexico is a permanent underclass state. 42% of our people are on Medicaid, 20% are at the federal poverty level. So, we're not arguing little tiny segments of our community. We're talking about people that are financially described in a required supportive profile. So to release the market forces, to be able to have the costs and prices maintain their or achieve their level in the marketplace, I think would be a boon to be able to manage costs and prices on that free market.
Okay, well, how do you folks out there find out more about the ad hoc committee and your efforts and how you can improve messaging for whether it's candidates, for individuals, having those round the dinner table conversations at the grocery store, whatever it is? How do people find out more about your efforts and take part in this effort to try to do a better job of messaging these core political values?
I would say not only core, but you have to go from message to what is my value to looking at the implementation by our government and then evaluating the results. And when you take that implementation to results part, it may change your perspective of what we have done. And we hope that happens. We are truly ad hoc. We don't have a website. Nobody is funding us. This is a group of people who have come together, and so I'm kind of the lead. You are welcome to call me, Janice Arnold-Jones, 505-379-0902, or my email. It's terribly long, jearnoldjones70@gmail.com. And we will share information. We will share everything that we have done, the research that we have done. We will come and talk with you. We will role play with you, because the most important thing that you can do today, if you want to save our state, is have a conversation in the line at the grocery store.
And you have regular meetings as well. So why don't you plug those? Because I know a lot of folks involved with that are involved with this.
Well, let me say, so we're on hiatus until the first Monday of August, but we meet at my house every Monday night and work on these issues. And we understand that there are many segments. Think about what is going on with our state and how we have to save our state. It's kind of like looking at the D-Day plans. There are many ways to get there. There are messages that candidates will need to put out. But at the end of the day, if we don't raise the tide, if we don't raise that awareness at our own dinner tables, we're not going to change.
All right. Janice Arnold-Jones and David Casas, thank you very much for coming in for this episode of Tipping Point, New Mexico. And thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point, New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.